about yourself as an historical actor.
And he says, it cuts out for some reason. He says, it's an opportunity to think of yourself as an historical actor towards historical action. Thinking historically is a central theme of the Institute and mirrors the central tenets of the curriculum, theater and its theory, that is to build a shared vision of a different social and educational future for the migrant and larger community through the process that I earlier spoke about called social dreaming. Thinking historically also means reading and write about texts that bring to life the reality of various forms of oppression. Texts like, and you may or may not know these texts, but these are graduate level texts, and I'm just going to name them for you. Texts that range from Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and Zaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, Ana Castillo's Countryless Woman, and Javier Indes' Biopower. These are hard texts. And we make them available, I haven't mentioned this here, but we make them available in the students' home language. And we get students who are not Latino as well, so we try to find ways to translate so that learning is available in the broadest sense. The students can use their full linguistic toolkit to engage in meaning making around these activities. But rather than succumbing to the sometimes more hopeless sides of critical pedagogies, there's also a conscious attempt to find hope and possibility in these new understandings that can serve as new tools for helping students read and write their way into the university, but as consciously historicized individuals. In the following excerpt, for example, students were asked to reread these same texts differently and to look for the ways each author creates hope, even as they talk about repressive aspects of society. And I think that's really fundamental because they're really engaged in really powerful stuff. And we felt it's our obligation to help them use these readings as tools to help them find hope and serve as resources for the future. The students proposed the idea of praxis as Freire's response to hope and feminism as Anzaldua's. And one student remarks that just the fact that these authors are writing such books, I guess it's like hope right there, to which the instructor responds.
That's like hope right there. Just the fact about, again, get the pencil out, everyone. Get the pencil. Get the pencil. Hold them high. Get the pencil. Out of all the weird things we want you to do, we showed you Fahrenheit 9/11. We talked about capitalism. We talked about like linguistic rights and linguistic oppression. We talked about reproduction and biopower. We even had some German truth. And Ana Castillo come to class. Right? We talking about all these ill things that happen in society, and we want you to do what? Pick up a pen and write your autobiography. Write your autobiography. Does it make sense? Yeah. It does kind of make sense. Because maybe if you start telling your story in a different way, you possibly can start living, different. You could possibly start thinking about the chapters yet to come, because you still have a lot of chapters.
Of significance, the process of transformation includes using a newly expanded toolkit to reframe one's own social historical circumstance as historical actors in ways that capture the complexities, the problems, and a hope that makes visible a solution. As the instructor says that you just heard, it does kind of make sense, because maybe if you start telling your story in a different way, you can possibly start living, differently. You can possibly start thinking about the chapters yet to come, because you still have a lot of chapters. Ava and her peers take up the challenge every year, and they begin to tell their stories in a different way. Ave wrote, slowly and painfully, I began to accept myself. My fourth grade teacher, Mr. Zamora, helped me with that process as he continually admired both my writing and math skills. I was even beginning to feel proud of myself, that is, until fifth grade. Are you Indian? The children would ask. Someone asked in order to point out my skin color and ugliness. Others supposedly to admire my intelligence. It remained glued to the back of my head. I just didn't belong. Once again, I was encouraged to become invisible, and I did. I returned to the job of watching and learning, a job I kept at school and in my house. All I ever did was listen to everything that was told, and I swallowed it. That's why school was so easy for me. I would remain quiet through classes, and I would listen, and this is what my teachers admired the most. I memorized, and that's what people called intelligence. I wrote about my grandmother's death, and that's what people called good writing. so good that they gave me a medal for it. It was what Paulo Freire speaks about in the second chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, banking education, and I was a piggy bank. These students appropriate these social concepts. Again, these are students have just deplorable schooling conditions. And in this short time, given all the information, they pick up these tools that I just have to insert. That what's funny is that every year for 10 years, by the end of the first week, I get a petition from them. And they're using all the readings that they've had, and they say, Dr. Gutierrez, you're oppressing us. We have to get up early, we're tired, we have to do all this, and this is oppression, and we love it because this is exactly, they're getting the text, they're learning how to use these tools. So every year I have to get them in a big room like this, and then they present me with their petition, and they use the readings and everything and the language to just show how oppressed they're being. And so every year I tell them that, yes, I agree with them about oppression, etc. But then I tell them that what's really being oppressed is when they are not respected for the intelligence that they have and pushed in the ways that we're pushing them. And all of a sudden, every single year, they just sit up and they're like, oh, okay. And then they go back on, and for the next 2 weeks, they're fine, right? But what's wonderful is that through their action that they really are understanding these very, very complex texts because it's meaningful and part of who they are, both historically and locally. I would say that in the Vygotskian sense, students like Ave could not only carry out the task by the end of the 4-week institute, but could accomplish it in new ways, drawing on new tools, replacing one psychological function with the other, yet each straining in different ways and requiring varied, persistent, and strategic assistance. For us, the mastery of cultural practices as a means towards the development of higher psychological functions is mediated by semiotic tools, a process Wells calls semiotic apprenticeship. And what you see here are just these brief moments in the classroom, but you have to know how much of it is small group work, how much of it is joint activity, mediated by a range of tools and experiences. So I don't want you to get I don't want to misrepresent what's going on in this context. As we've learned from our own work, the historically generated practices around schooling can be re-mediated through the reorganization of learning and pedagogy, its relationships, and cultural resources for thinking. Specifically, our focus has been on developing new tools, like the autobiography that I just showed you, that promote new roles and activities, and thus new opportunities to extend social and cognitive development, while paradoxically preparing students for the university and developing a social critical literacy. I want to insert here that part of the larger work is we actually track these students with the Office of the President of the University of California. And I can tell you that for the last cohort we did, 2000 to 2004, all of these kids will apply to college, the 100 that come. Half of them will apply to the University of California, which you know is one of the most competitive public educational systems. 89% of those applying get into the University of California, and most of those to Berkeley and UCLA. And the Office of President tells us that those are higher statistics than any outreach program they've seen. And so what I hope that you're getting is that how differently we're remediated in ways that, by the way, we had a control group of students who were migrant kids who didn't come, were admitted but didn't come, and they had slightly higher academic profiles. And interestingly, they applied to a lower degree to the UC and thus got admitted. So there is something to say about their presence at an institution, being given the tools of how to negotiate what it means to be in those elite institutions that is really central. It is important to insert a cautionary note here. Oh, by the way, I tell them if they get admitted to UCLA, they can have a job in my office. So I really have to get more funds, Dean, to try to do this because they're getting admitted a lot, and I promise them they'll have a job. Learning in this it's important to insert a cautionary note here because this often happens with non-dominant students. Learning in this activity system cannot be reduced to the appropriation of tools that help enhance personal growth, develop voice, or skill build, although these are arguably important byproducts. Instead, the object is a constitution of what G calls a social semiotic toolkit that extends students' repertoires of practice in ways that enable students to become designers of their own social futures. Part of this toolkit includes ways to understand better how to respond to the oppression, the consequences of poverty. Education, that is a particular form of critical education learning, is offered up as one particular response. As Manuel had said to you earlier, with all the repression and the oppression and suffering in the world, we're telling you to pick up books. We're asking you to study. That's what we do with oppression. Maybe this is a beginning for us. Who knows? Right? This is a place. Think about this place as a workshop, as a factory. Una maquila pero de sueños. A factory, but a factory of dreams. Right, now, why is all that colored? I'm not going to have time to do this, but I want to insert here just a second because for those of you who are in language and literacy, this would be another talk. Because there is what I'm going to argue in a second is that in these rich spaces where there's deep learning going on, what I call third spaces, they're constituted by a range of those interactional things that I showed you earlier. But I also hear a distinct grammar at work. They sounded differently, so I went and did a grammatical analysis. And so let me just share with you a little bit of what I hear, and then I'll explain just a tad for those of you who are not language people, but you're all involved with education, so I think it's relevant. When we look at the words and this was my coding, so let me go back to when we look at the words and grammatical structures in this segment, what we see is a series of choices that are meant to lead participants to a reframing of the university as a factory of dreams, maquila de sueños, and of their work at the university as work, involving their imaginations to dream their futures. The use of the word factory is important as social dreaming is hard. Not only this work entails thinking, imagining, questioning, reading, writing, and contemplating. Here the directives orient the students to do cognitive work. And this is really important because if you study classrooms like I have for 10 years, the directives you hear might be, I'm going to give you an exaggerated form, but they'll be sit down, write this, do this, right? Those are directives. The directives that I'm trying to illustrate to you here are directives that orient you to do cognitive activity, that orient you to think about things. So they're fundamentally different kinds of directives. Here the directives orient the students to do cognitive work. For example, the words let's are used, and let's try, let's go see what's on the other side. They're also collective. And one of the things I argue in this larger work is that central to this is creating a collective third space. It is a collective space, and you hear it in the language. Let's see what's on the other side. Requires students to consider collectively and individually what's beyond the horizon, their classes, their futures. Such terms are often labeled inclusive imperatives, but here I think they're inclusive directives that further emphasize the shared nature of this dreaming process. The conscious use of social theory, hybrid language practices, and by hybrid language practices, I don't mean code switching, because I think that may have a deficit perspective. Hybrid language practices, I think whether it's another language code or a different register, hybrid language practices is the use of the student's complete linguistic toolkit in the service of learning. And that's what I refer to as hybrid language practices. Play and the imagination, high-level texts in both Spanish and English, guided questions, writing for learning and social action, as well as the academy, dialogue and metaphor, for example, become the toolkit for learning and development, as well as for linking the historical and immediate past, the present, and the imagined future through social dreaming, a collective dream for the better world. The following vignette shows the introduction of this key metaphor of social dreaming to the students on the second day of the program, the first day of class of one particular year. So the use of conceptual metaphors and play and the embodied imagination as leading activities, the reframing of education begins. As the students are walking to class, they come from their dorms, a very long walk from the dorms up to the classrooms, escorted by their entire instructional and residential staff. They come across one of their instructors feigning sleep on the path to their classroom. He tells them he's been dreaming, asks them what they dream about, and a discussion about their dreams ensues. There are a variety of student responses, including, like things that I can't really do now, but I want to. And someone else says, I dream of flying. both which are taken up in the joint construction of a definition of social dreaming. This is a powerful segment in which participants engage in a discussion about dreaming, in which they move from an individual notion of dreaming, such as wishing for 3 houses and a Yukon, to a collective form of dreaming, a social dream for a better educational and social future for their community. Part of the same discussion includes accounting on how they came to be sitting up on the ground at UCLA, the first in their families to do so. They're told, "We are our parents' dreams in lots of ways. You're the realization of someone's dream. A lot of people had to do a lot of dreaming to get you here, and a lot of people had to do a lot of work to make those dreams come true in order to have you here." In this segment as well, students have participated in an imaginary play where, through embodied imagination, they are young children once again, but with the power to create a world where education is different. So they're asked to think about what education was like when they were little and then how they would like it to be. They're also brought to a time in the present where they collectively, where they collectively grieve over the death of a 12-year-old African-American boy whose body had just been found in a dumpster in South LA, and who, through the imagination, is brought back to life to be honored and remembered. As they are about to receive their course readers for the program, they engage in a brief theatro act in which they attempt to fly by flapping their arms, their wings. The metaphors of flying and wings are used to reframe the leading activity of learning. The reading of their course texts as flying with their minds, and their course reader as tools and wings, or herramientas in Spanish, as the tools for studying, reading books, and the vehicles by which dreams can come true. Here, the use of Spanish and English texts, and the encouragement to use whatever language is necessary to read, write, and make sense, makes Spanish an unmarked language, a sharp contrast to California classrooms, where the home language is largely prohibited and learning is a disembodied practices.
Hard. Flying is even more difficult, right? I've never been able to fly. I've been trying for years and I haven't. But maybe I have, I don't know. But you need wings to fly. You need wings to fly. You're not going to do it just like this. Everybody clap. Everybody clap. Nobody's off the ground. Everybody try. Get off the ground. Go. Go. Everybody go. Nobody's up there. Walk over there and get your wings. Those are your readers. That's what you're going to be reading this month. That's what you're going to be working with. That's what I said to herramienta. That's going to be your tool. Go get your wings.
As you will see shortly through metaphor, the playful embodied imagination, the use of Spanish to connect home, community, and the past and the present with future action, the collective nature of social dreaming is enacted as Jesus, a student in the program, flies through an educational system with the help of his peers to help create a learning context that is simultaneously historical, critical, local, collective, and individual. Near the beginning of the clip, Jesus, who's going to be poised like Superman, ready to fly, sheepishly asks, "How do I fly?" To which Manuel answers, "Find a way, right?" He said, "Cómo?" He said, "How?" And the students laugh. That's the question. Es la pregunta. How? Exactly how do we fly? How do we socially dream? Here, Manuel turns Jesus' question to a means of connecting the present to the hypothetical and to the larger question of this learning activity that serves as a workshop for the kind of problem solving they will do as they figure out how to dream socially and collectively. That's what we're going to talk about for a month. You can't do it. You can't do it by yourself. It's going to take everybody. Let's make Jesus fly. Social dreaming is hard. The following vignette is a beautiful example of how, through embodied action, students and the instructional staff begin the process of building that collective dream.
Jesus asked if we can make it. I want to make it fly. We need to make it fly. Not one of us can make it fly. Right? It's going to take all of us. I think this is what it's about. It's about collectively flying. When I say social dreaming, it's different than individual dreaming. Because in individual dreams, yo quiero tres casas y un Yukon, solo me pongo a trabajar, ahorrar el dinero, and I got it. If I want 3 homes in a Yukon, I work hard, save it, be kind of selfish, and I'll get that dream. kind of dreams that we're talking about here, that we're going to talk about for a month, you can't do them. You can't do by yourself. It's going to take everybody. We're trying to make this fun. It's going to take a lot of effort. Who's going to be my backup when we get live? Yeah. Okay? Let's see you jump in. When one of us gets tired, we'll tell you. Okay? First thing, we don't drop Jesus. Alright? You want to fly again? You know you're going to fly? No, but you don't want to fall either. Okay? Right? He does not get hurt. Alright? Keep him in. Find a way. Right? He said, ¿cómo? He said, how? That's the question. Es la pregunta. How? Exactly. How do we fly? How do we socially dream?
These are very steep steps, by the way, almost perpendicular.
Help! Fly, bro! This is the only time in your life you're gonna fly. This is the only time your body's gonna be 3 feet off the ground like that. Social dreaming is hard.
As you can see, we take an ecological approach to learning, and thus opportunities for learning are created in natural activity across the day, in collective activity in residential life, mealtime, the long walk up Bruin Walk, the path from the dorms to the classroom, in tutorials, in recreational time in teatro, in gender circles, and numerous spontaneous events, as you will see shortly. However, the emerging understandings and concepts are always elaborated in formal instructional activity. One opportunistic event to enact social theory, to collectively problem solve, and to begin to build new identities as members of the UCLA communities occurred before they've even participated in their first formal class in the Institute. This incident emerged as a group you saw earlier continue their trek across campus. Rather than being able to pursue their planned path of travel, the group finds that the entire area has been converted into a cheerleading camp filled with hundreds of bouncing teenage girls from across the state. One of the instructors seizes the opportunity to introduce students to social theory and a pragmatic form of social analysis grounded in their everyday experience. The block pathway that alters the group's intended route onto their classrooms becomes symbolic of the obstacles students will encounter throughout their first month at UCLA and throughout their lives. First, the instructor details a range of options to solve the problem of what to do with encountered obstacles, and instructs the students to think symbolically about all the things that are going to get in your way. The obstacles in their path are people, but he directs them to think metaphorically as the barriers about which they will discuss throughout their stay at UCLA, the social structures and a societal system that impede progress towards a new social reality. We're going to go around the cheerleaders, he says, and directs them to smile and walk confidently as legitimate members of the UCLA community as they take their new course around the cheerleading groups. And he says, and think about all that symbolically about all the things that are going to get in your way. We're going to go around them. Sometimes we'll jump over them. Sometimes we have to knock them down. Today we don't. Today we find a space to move around them. All right, let's go.
1, hit 2, push it up, hit to the front, 6, circle 7, and 6, sliding 1, look 2, 3, and 4, 5, and 6, and pop, down, 1, bang.
By reframing this space as theirs, with the right to inhabit the space that constitutes UCLA, students, with the assistance of their instructors, begin an apprenticeship in which they can learn how to respond to the daily taunts and name-calling, like illegals, Mexicans go home, that they will experience as they move around campus. These real events later become the content of the scenarios of the Theater of the Oppressed, as well as the study of social theory and writing assignments. This apprenticeship in not conceding space is an important developmental task that these migrant students, and certainly immigrants, especially indigenous immigrants, face. Such strategies are rarely part of the toolkit acquired in most formal learning situations. Any of you who take notice of the many ways domestic workers, janitors in the buildings in which we work, many workers maybe in this building, move out of the pathway of others, eyes averted, can begin to understand that such practices have a long history in oppression and are in need of remediation. Through these embodied cognitive activities, I hope I've shown you, and a rich interactional matrix of language practices, learning becomes situated, reciprocal, and distributed, and leads to new forms of learning and a reframing of the role of education and the self as an historical actor, and at the same time to the development of an important set of tools that facilitate social and cognitive activity. By exploiting the dialectic between the real and the imagined world, the individual and the social, between the world as it is and the world as it could be, we see that institutions of learning can be transformed. In closing, I want to say that the story of the Migrant Institute should not be considered an utopian narrative, but rather as an example of what's possible when educators and educational researchers arrange educational environments in ways that incite, support, and extend students' repertoires of practice. By organizing the frequency and co-occurrence and difficulty of cultural practices and forms of mediation, and by persisting in the struggle for intersubjectivity toward a new vision of education and the world. I end this talk in the same way I started, with the words of a wise migrant student, Daniel, who exemplifies how social critical literacy serves as a resource personally and academically, immediately and in the future. And I'm going to read this, I'll translate it for you. This is a student who had not been in this country for very long. And what had happened is that when he got the invitation to come, he wasn't sure if he wanted to come to the program. And his father said, well, you can have a choice. You can go to the Institute or you can work. And what he's trying to say this first part is that he saw something in his father's eyes, something in him that said, you need to go to the Institute. He says, the years passed. He'd been writing his autobiography about coming to this country. And he says, the years passed and I got used to the United States. And then in June of 2004, I had a great opportunity. I had the opportunity to come to MSLI, that's our program. And this is where I discovered the significance of the light that I saw in the cave, in the bottom of the cave that I saw when I saw my father, when he asked me if I wanted to come. The lights signified a new life that I'm about to begin. My wish to help my parents, my desire that my parents and brothers be proud of me as I become the first person in my family to graduate from the university. And then he just switches to English. Also, the MSLI helped me to understand who I am. I am a hardworking student. I am my parents' hope. I am a person who has a goal. This is a 9th grader, by the way, going to the 10th grade. I am a story to be written. The most important thing, I am a hard worker's son. Finally, I am the author of my life, and I will live to write the successes of my life. The story will continue. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to. There's so much to this whole framework. I also do this with young children, K through 5, in an after-school club. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Kris Gutierrez. Currently, I'm the Cultural Foundations of Education program. I know you do a lot of work with Latino immigrants, but I guess my question is, considering the racial tension right now between Black U.S. people and also Latinos, particularly Mexicans in Southern California, and really spread throughout California at this point. Do you do any work around fostering solidarity and fostering a space between that sort of tension?
Absolutely, yes. Both professionally and use the microphone. I have to say it's not only an ethical, important and political issue for me, it's also a personal issue. My son is both Mexican and African American. And I've raised him so that he never wants to, he's made his own box in the census for a long time because he refuses to have to give up who he is. But this is a really important question. And I've given up doing the migrant program. It's 10 years because I never had a